Jill and I were 29 years old when we left good jobs at a flourishing church in Baton Rouge. When we made that decision, it seemed like the wise thing to do, but by the time we left, the job market had contracted and we weren't so sure anymore. We had no jobs and we had no prospects, but we did have grad school debt. So we moved into my in-laws' house. And I know what you're thinking, but back in 2010, to move into your in-laws' house was uncool. We looked for jobs all week, and then on Sundays we went to church. And as former church leaders, it's easy to get a little bit overly picky. So we just had two criteria. Jill wanted a church that had good Bible teaching, and I wanted a church that had good donuts. And so we landed at a church that was a fit. It was a pretty large church. The room was dark. Occasionally, a friend of ours was on the worship team to play a pad on the keyboard. There was a smoke machine. And I don't remember any of the teachings, but I do remember week after week there near the back row, looking over at Jill during a worship set with the stage lights glinting on her face when the clouds of fake smoke parted and we could see tears pouring down each other's cheeks. We've chatted on and off over the years about what was behind those tears, why we cried our way through several weeks of worship there. Probably some of it was just a big sense of release, as this was the first time in years that we were responsible for nothing on a Sunday morning other than to show up and to worship and listen. But some of those tears, I've thought this week, are explained by this story that Doris just read for us. I'm going to call it Why Sometimes We Resent Jesus and Each Other. Ready to get down to work? Doesn't sound like it. You ready to get down to work? All right, let me pray and then we will. Father, would you come among us by your Spirit? I believe you're here. Even as people across this country and elsewhere in the world gather expectant because you are pouring your Holy Spirit out, particularly on young people. We too gather here, asking that you would meet with us. That you'd help us to get our imaginations into an ancient text, and that you'd help us to position our hearts with humility before you so that we can be changed. And that might mean encouragement for some of us, and it might mean healing for some of us. It might mean emboldening, empowering, chastening. Whatever it is that you want to do among us this morning by your Spirit, I pray that you would do that this morning. Amen. We're over a month now into the series we're calling The Way of Jesus, a journey through Luke's gospel. Last Sunday, Cameron Williams took us to the heart of Jesus' identity in Luke chapter 9 in a scene called the Transfiguration. Today is Pastor Kim's birthday, so Pastor Kim and Cameron are away celebrating. Let's make sure when we see them again to tell them just how much we appreciate both of them. Right after that scene that Cam preached, at the end of Luke chapter 9, we get verse 51 that says this, and as the time for Jesus to ascend approached, Jesus set out resolutely for Jerusalem. That phrase, set out resolutely, is literally in the Greek to set your face toward, to fix your face toward somewhere. And I think it's probably an idiom for being sent on a mission, for being dispatched to do a particular thing in a particular place. At least that's the way that phrase gets used in other ancient Near Eastern languages. The reason I bring this up, apart from being an Enneagram 5, is because Luke makes a bigger deal out of this Jerusalem word, temple word, cross word journey than any of the other gospel writers do. From now on, from chapter 9, verse 51, through the events of Holy Week, everything that Luke tells us is happening on the way. It's the sort of deliberate choice that a filmmaker makes in telling a story. The goal seems to be that we interpret everything that happens between 9:51 and chapter 20, verse 1 as sort of constitutive of the way of Jesus. These are the things that happen. These are part of the journey that is toward a cross and that goes into a tomb and that on Eastern Day is resurrected to new life. I'm going to give you one more detail, the relevance of which will become apparent in a little bit. Some of you might zone out. Don't fall asleep. This will be short, and you're on camera. If you've spent much time reading the four tellings of the life of Jesus, you might have noticed that three of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are very similar. I've got a Venn diagram that I ripped off Pinterest there. Mark is the shortest and probably the earliest of those three, and it seems like, more than likely, Matthew and Luke have used Mark as sort of an outline, and they've expanded on Mark, and they've added material to Mark, and they've rearranged Mark when they want to for the purposes of making their particular point. But as you'll see, there's a lot of overlap. Luke has about 35% unique material to Luke, and the majority of that happens in this section, the on the road section, the on the way section. This is when Luke, as it were, departs from the script. If Luke isn't following Mark at this point, what is he following? You see, anytime you tell a story, you're always choosing what to put in and what to leave out. That's just, we naturally do it. Something shapes, informs those decisions. And one of the best suggestions about what is guiding Luke here is that he is in dialogue with the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy. In fact, if you read Luke chapter 9 through Luke chapter 20, you'll find that he is interacting with snippets from, in the same order as, Deuteronomy 5 through 28. And this sort of makes sense because if you think about it, in Luke's sequel to this, the book of Acts, he goes on to make the point that Jesus is a sort of new and greater Moses. So file that away in a rarely accessed part of your brain, and we'll get back to it in a little bit. So Jesus sets out toward Jerusalem. And anytime you travel somewhere on a multi-day journey, where you stop to rest and eat and sleep matters. Jill and I just started watching The Chosen recently, and in that second episode of the first season, there's that little girl, Abigail, who encounters Jesus, who's obviously a traveling man. Do you remember what she keeps asking him? Where do you live? Where do you live? As we might expect then, from the end of chapter 9, the beginning of chapter 10, they're preoccupied with this idea of hospitality. In the New Testament, that word is literally love of the foreigner, love of the stranger. Hospitality in the ancient world was a prized cultural value, but especially so among Christians. Like, Americans are dog lovers, but Oregonians are dog lovers. Christians lived this radical hospitality, and it was partly through their hospitality that they transformed the Roman Empire within just a few centuries. Many of you will know that hospitality is one of our three core values here at St. Mo's. This emphasis on hospitality is what makes today's story all the more problematic. Because, see, Martha is the one who is giving hospitality. Martha is the one who does the right thing. But it's Mary that Jesus commends. What's going on here? Martha is a remarkable woman. She's introduced to us not as somebody's daughter or not as somebody's husband. She stands on her own right in the New Testament. She's likely quite well off or perhaps widowed. She seems to be the master of her own house. And she and her sister Mary and their brother Lazarus form a deep friendship with Jesus. They become some of his closest friends, probably in no small part due to the hospitality that she shows to Jesus and his disciples whenever they are traveling through the village of Bethany. So she's determined to put on a great spread. That is the culturally appropriate thing to do. That is the religiously appropriate thing to do for a good Jewish host. But If we had read the story that occurs just before this one, the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke already would have made us a little bit suspicious about culturally appropriate and religiously appropriate things, right? Remember that priest and that temple worker who gave a wide berth to the beaten half-to-death man? Presumably because they did not want to become ritually unclean. They did the culturally and religiously appropriate thing. However, the culturally and religiously appropriate things aren't always the way of Jesus. But I have no trouble giving Martha the benefit of the doubt here. I think that she genuinely wanted to host Jesus well, to put on a nice spread, and to make sure that everybody has plenty to eat, and then some more. Remember, Jerusalem's in the south. So picture Martha with me. You can see her there, can't you? Jesus is teaching in the main room of the house, and she is in the next little room, the kitchen, and she's bent over the soup, and she's kneading and punching down the dough, and she's dividing it into little balls, and she's slapping them onto the inside of the taboon oven, and then, oh shoot, we're almost out of wine. The liquor store's closed on. God, somebody needs to go next door and borrow some from the neighbors, and then, oh my goodness, these guys' feet reek. Somebody needs to take a basin out there and a rag and let them wash. Mary, could you just, Mary? I saw this dad joke the other day that said, I kept trying to get my wife's attention, and eventually I just sat down uncomfortable. That did it. I think some of you are like, what? I imagine Martha discovers Mary there, sitting at Jesus' feet, just listening, and all of a sudden she goes from being distracted by all the things she had to do, all the things she had going on, to now being distracted by Mary just sitting there. And now it has an edge to it. I've got a million things going on, and you're just sitting there? Have you ever noticed when you start comparing yourself to other people, it adds to the distraction? Like, no longer are you just worried about your own stuff, but now you're worried about them and why they don't seem to be worried about their stuff in the same way that you're worried about your stuff. So without really understanding what's happened, Martha goes from wanting to be a good friend and host to all of a sudden resenting the sacrifices that she is making compared to her sister. Some of you went to undergrad here at Hopkins with Cara Orji. Anybody? I think some of you are on Zoom who were at Hopkins with Cara. Cara's dad is a Nigerian-Canadian Anglican bishop married to a Singaporean-Canadian woman. They live in South Texas. Yeah, it's like they are the United Nations. I had him about 10 years ago to speak at a little pastor's retreat that Kenneth and I organized annually for a small group of pastors in West Virginia. And just last year, I was talking to a local pastor here who was there the year that Bishop Orji spoke, and he said, I still have not forgotten one sentence he said. And I was like, what was that? I must have been in the kitchen. That was a joke. And he said, there's only one sacrifice. I was like, what does that mean? So he had to unpack it for me. And this friend said, in church world, in ministry world, there can be this sort of creeping pressure to just serve more and more and more, to do more and more and more, until one day you wake up and you're burnt out. Or one day you wake up and you resent all the people who are not serving as much as you are. And sometimes you even resent Jesus. But what the bishop said is there's only one ultimate sacrifice. The church is built on Jesus' sacrifice. He has already made it. It's not built on ours. Of course, there is work to do. By the way, we have openings on the security team. There are ways to serve. Of course, those ways to serve won't always be convenient. But when we find ourselves resenting our serving, there is a decent chance that we're more focused on our sacrifice than we are on appreciating his ultimate one. And I just want to pause and say there are a lot of you who have shouldered heavy loads in this church since we began 6.5 years ago. We've tried not to take people for granted. We've tried not to burn people out, but I have definitely failed sometimes. Some people, maybe some of you sitting here or with us on Zoom, have felt like I've expected too much of you. What I've asked of you in serving was more than reasonable, and I'm sorry for that. That's not the way we want to be, and that was not good leadership on my part. And many of you carry heavy responsibilities and serve a lot in other ministries outside of St. Mo's. And it doesn't even have to be a formal organization, does it? Many of us have this deep inner drive to do, to serve, serve, serve. And Martha here is a cautionary tale because she ends up resenting her service, resenting her sister, and transferring the resentment onto Jesus. Did you see that? Look with me at verse 40. Martha was distracted by the big dinner she was preparing. She came to Jesus and said, "Lord, doesn't it seem unfair to you that my sister just sits here while I do all the work? Tell her to come and help me." Instead of having a quiet word with her sister, do you notice this? Psst, sis, set your face toward the kitchen. Instead of doing that, she goes to Jesus. She pulls Jesus into it. Maybe she wants to see Mary publicly dressed down. Or more likely, I think, she resents the fact that Jesus is letting Mary sit there while she does all the work. I've tried to underline for you there in English on the screen something that seems to be an emphasis in the Greek. Martha's complaint is focused on herself, actually. She began in service of Jesus, and that has turned to distraction, and from distraction to resentment, and from resentment to self-focus. Jesus' response to her is kind, it's understanding, but still he graciously communicates that Mary has chosen the better way. Kenneth and I grew up two of 5 siblings. If you grew up with multiple kids in your home, you know that there's got to be protocol around how you divide food. In our house, if there was a leftover cookie that needed to be divided 5 ways, that means you're going to get a crumb, but it also means that whoever does the dividing has to be the last one to choose a portion. Got to keep them honest. The difficulty comes when the thing to be divided is not of uniform excellence. Everybody wants the slice of cake that's got the deepest icing. Everybody wants, right, Declan, that cinnamon roll from the middle of the pan because it's got the softest sides. It's what my English friends would call the best bit. Everyone wants the best bit. That's what Mary has chosen. Here's Jesus' reply to Martha in verse 41 and 42. The Lord said to her, "My dear Martha, you're worried and upset over all of these things. There's only one thing worth being concerned about. Mary has discovered it, and it won't be taken away from her." Mary has found the best bit, and Jesus is not about to take it from her. This isn't a story about idleness over industrious. Almost certainly, Mary actually helped a little bit in preparing. In verse 39 in the Greek, there's an additional kai, means and or also. That's for you, Ellie, but you're not even here. You're on sabbatical. Nobody else cares. But that suggests that, at least initially, Mary also helped receive Jesus into the home. But certainly the main thrust of this story is that rather than becoming distracted with all this kind of culturally appropriate hospitality, Mary has single-minded focus. Some of you might have seen the 1975 Wimbledon men's final. Pitted the young big hitter Jimmy Connors against the past prime Arthur Ashe. Arthur Ashe was 32. The fact that that was considered past prime, I find personally offensive. But Connors was red hot. He'd gone 99-4 that year. And he bashed his way in this Wimbledon tournament boisterously all the way to the finals, and he never once looked beatable. Arthur Ashe, in his own day, had been a hard hitter too, but not like this young guy. Well, Connors and his warm-up partner were out there hamming it up on the court, warming it up, all grins and bravado and big hits. Ash and his coach sat quietly in the locker room and came up with a plan. And then Ash went out onto the court and he executed that plan with single-minded focus. Instead of his normal hard, flat serve that Connors would have been delighted to give, that Ash would have been delighted to give, but which Connors would have been delighted to whip back even harder, Ash just floated his serve out wide and slow. Instead of big, meaty forehands that Connors could bash back at him, Ash just did little dinks over the neck, over the net, little airy floaters and little chippy back spinners. And Ash took that first set 6-1. Second set 6-1. And then Connors came alive and he started to rally and he won the third set 5-7. Everything, I'm imagining, in Ash wanted to play Connors' game. That was sort of his game too, the big hits, to hit hard and fast. But he focused on this plan. It was actually not his instinct, but it was the only way to win this game. Little chippy dippers. You guys can tell I know the tennis lingo. Took that last set 6-4. That's the sort of focus that I imagine Mary had as she sat at Jesus' feet listening to him. She's so focused that not only is she resisting the gravitational pull of cultural norms into hospitality mode, but she is also focused enough that she is transgressing cultural norms of gender too. She's sitting there at Jesus' feet, the posture of a close disciple, almost certainly the posture of a male disciple. She's chosen the best bit, and Jesus was not about to take it away from her. What is this best bit that she's chosen? What is her focus all about? I think today we'd probably call it being present to Jesus. Sort of unhurried, undistracted, no agenda sort of attention. Attention, Mary Oliver, the poet, reminds us, attention is the beginning of devotion. Ask your friends how to show them that you love them. My guess is they will say something like that. They know that you love them when you give them your attention, when you are present to them. But that notion of being present, it's kind of our current idiom. It's a bit squishy, though. So this is where we need to toggle back to that detail that probably seemed a little extra back in the beginning. Remember, this is where I said that Luke seems to be in dialogue with Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy and Luke 9:51 through 21 are in conversation. And we see that conversation crop up. Remember Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. That comes up in Luke. That is a conversation that Jesus and the leader have that precipitates Jesus telling the parable of the Good Samaritan. So you keep reading in both of these texts next to each other, and you get to this in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3, in a section talking about God providing manna for his people, bread from heaven in the wilderness. People do not live by bread alone. Rather, we live by every word that comes from the mouth of God. So while Martha is distracted by the many tasks of hospitality, which in the day you could have summarized as making them bread, her sister Mary is present to Jesus. More specifically, Mary pays attention to the words that come from the mouth of the Lord. And that's the way Luke expresses it too. For us, this better way, this best bit that we must choose, this spending time, it is spending time with Jesus, but it is especially spending time with Jesus, paying attention to his word. That's reading the Bible carefully, but it's also making space in our prayer. to hear the voice of God through the Holy Spirit illuminating and giving us insight into his word and expanding on it in our lives in ways that are congruent with it. This is the best bit, being attentive to the voice of the Good Shepherd. This story is not pitting contemplation against action. Sorry, Thomas Merton. It's not pitting service of God against listening to God. We are to serve God. We are to labor for Christ. We are to pursue excellence in hospitality. We're supposed to pursue excellence in everything, but excellence must not become the substitute for availability. We mustn't let work for God take the place of enjoying being with God and listening to him. And I think that maybe explains some of my tears in the fake smoke in the back row. See, at the heart of this story is a fundamental difference between the way of Jesus and every other religion, ancient or modern. Here's the difference. Where ancient religions assumed that the gods had needs and they created humans to service their needs, the Bible resolutely claims that God has no needs and he is loving and he created humans in love for a relationship with him. You are made out of the overflow of God's love, not because he needs you. And that's why we find Paul talking to the Athenians in Acts chapter 16, Luke's sequel, chapter 17, and he says, the one true God is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. It's why we find King Jesus saying of himself in those remarkable words in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Ian, where are you going with this? The other day, John Sims and I had a conversation about the Odyssey. Not the Honda kind, the Homer kind. I know, middle-aged guy, 4 kids, could have been the minivan. One of the main themes of the Odyssey is hospitality. One of the themes of the ancient world in general is hospitality. Inviting strangers in, feeding them, providing for them, and sending them on their journey. Critical part, indispensable part of travel in the ancient world. Ancient hospitality had a major difference from ours that's often overlooked. Here it is. Today, if you're particularly polite, if you go to somebody's house, you take a guest gift, a bottle of wine, a piece of bread, hopefully a whole loaf of bread, a bouquet of flowers or whatever. In the ancient world, the host gives the gift. The traveler was just a traveler trying to stay alive. The host is the one there in their security. The host is the one who becomes the giver of gifts. And so all throughout the Odyssey and all through all the other epic literature of the ancient world, you see the host giving gifts as the guest departs. Furthermore, there's this kind of intuitive political dance where it's also up to the host when the guest departs. If you leave too soon as a guest, that's rude. Or if you overstay your welcome, that's rude. It's up to the host to determine when the guest departs and to give them a gift that, here we go, enriches them and equips them for their journey, for their future, for what's next. I was reflecting on this ancient tradition, and I was thinking about Jesus' Last Supper with his friends. Remember when he's in that upper room? We don't technically know who the host is. Remember, we're told that Jesus sent his disciples on ahead to prepare the meal in a room that was pre-furnished, but we don't know who owns the house. We don't know who the host was, or hostess, could have been. But if we pay attention to the words that Jesus says, we get a clue. John chapter 14, Jesus promises everyone at that meal a gift. I'll ask my Father, and he will give you his Spirit. Or if we stay with Luke, in the sequel to his gospel, we see this in Acts chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. Jesus tells his disciples, do not leave Jerusalem until the Father sends you the gift he promised. As I told you before, John baptized with water, but in just a few days, you will be baptized with the Spirit. Then you can depart. Do you see what I'm saying? You tracking with me? Jesus has given his guests the best possible gift. It's one that both enriches them and one that equips them for the rest of their journey. He's given them the Spirit of the living God. And the fact that he is the one both giving them the gift and the one determining when it's time for them to depart means, in the ancient world, what? It means he is the host. And the host doesn't need anything from you. There's no bread you can bake that will fill him. There's no cushion you can arrange that will make him more comfortable. There's no house you can build that will contain him. His chief desire is for you. He wants you to just join Mary and get unbusy for a moment and sit at his feet and pay attention to him, to listen to his voice.